Hey, welcome everybody. And special welcome to people at home as well. But a special welcome also to you here in the room. We're very happy you're here, and I don't know whether we're back to the old normal or the new normal, but we're back to having people in a room, and we're very happy to have that, and let's hope that this continues. My name is Kees Leijenhorst. On behalf of Radboud Reflects, I want to welcome you to this evening about Dune. In 1965, Frank Herbert wrote the original novel, followed by a sequel of novels about this fantastic world inhabited by worms called Arrakis. I read the novel in 1984. I missed the failed movie that David Lynch made in 1984. But now the occasion, I guess, why we are here now is the new movie, the 2021 movie Dune by Denis Villeneuve. I want to make a quick poll. Who has read the original novel? Yeah, very good. Who has seen the movie? Few people haven't, very good. This is going to be full of spoilers, so you can still leave. Tonight, as said, we are going to there are many aspects to the movie and to the original novel that we can discuss, but there are two aspects that stand out. One is the religion of it. There's a whole system and whole belief system that is woven into the novel and also in the movie. And the other is the ecological aspect. Arrakis is a desert planet, but it is a desert planet that can be turned into a green one. It's exploited. So there's a bit of colonialism as well. We're going to discuss that probably also at some point, but these two aspects will be discussed tonight, the ecological and the religious aspect. And we've got two scholars that will address these issues, these two issues. The first is Lisa Doeland, who is a philosopher at Radboud University. And the second is Seth Bledsoe, who is a scholar of religion, also at Radboud University. Always amazing how many people we get from Radboud University. First, Lisa is going to talk, and followed directly by Seth, and that's followed by questions. The questions will still be done by Menti, so there will be no microphone distributed in the room, in the lecture hall. You can ask your questions also if you're in the room, through menti.com, and the number you have to insert is 31176899, and I think it's going to be projected at some point, but I'll repeat the number when the question round is there. So first we're going to have a discussion followed by questions from you, the audience, and also people at home can, of course, ask the questions through Menti. Lisa.
Yes. I am very happy to be here, and I didn't know it was the first, physical Radboud Reflects meeting, so I'm extra honored to be here, talking about Dune. So I always answer the call, says Duke Leto Atreides in Denis Villeneuve's adaptation of the novel Dune. So I did it too when I got the call to discuss this movie here tonight, because I thought, what's not to like? It's science fiction, it's ecology, it's a book I always wanted to read, but never got around to. It turned out to be perhaps a bit more about politics and adventure, some kind of adventure tale or legend than I had expected. Perhaps also a bit like Game of Thrones. I always pay my debts, says the Duke Leto Atreides in the book. Just like in the Game of Thrones movie, of course. I always pay my debts, say the Lannisters. So there's an interesting similarity, I think, that we will not address, but that really stood out for me. So when we turn to the political aspect, the several families or houses that are involved in this tale, this political tale. I must say that just like with Game of Thrones, I had a bit of a hard time catching on. But there is a warm place in my heart for Dune, for the book as well. But I must say that the certain aspects that I will address today, so the ecology part that I find most interesting, perhaps mostly on a theoretical level. And mind you, it was a fantastic movie. That actor, Timothy, I forgot his last name to pronounce his last name again, but I don't know, he's mesmerizing. You're just there. So if you haven't watched it, I suggest you do. So I read this book during the summer. I must say it was a bit of an uneasy summer, a bit of an apocalyptic summer. We had a heat dome, or we didn't, people and animals and things, plants in Canada had a heat dome. There were fires, there were floodings. We had that here in Limburg and in Germany, of course. And so I was there on vacation reading this book. And in the meantime, I don't know, the news kept flooding in anyway. It was a weird time. So I will address the notion of apocalypse and the apocalyptic tonight as well. I think it's there in the book somehow, although not explicitly, but that's why I've woven it into my story tonight. So, because I think that the thing with apocalyptic literature is that it's not so much about what's coming. These are always stories about what's going on already. They're stories not so much about the future, but about the present. So the question then is, what does Dune have to teach us today? What's the story it's telling right now? So I will try to unpack that a bit and argue that Dune's tale is a tale too, at least, of ecology, matters of ecology, and of planetary awareness. So awareness of the planet, our planet. Spoiler here. So the desert planet is just planet Earth sometime in the future. I think you find that out in, I don't know, novel number? Kind of, yeah. All right, but let's stay with Dune, with the book for a bit. So it was published, as Kees already pointed out, in 1965. This was, of course, a time of growing planetary awareness. It was 3 years after the publication of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring in '62, so a book about the problems of the use of pesticides for the environment. The idea that, I don't know, the next spring might be a silent one because, all the birds, the bees, the insects wouldn't live anymore. Also, published in the same year that James Lovelock started working on the idea that Earth might be a self-regulating system. This has become known as the Gaia Hypothesis. So Gaia is a Greek goddess that personifies Earth. She's so Mother Nature, really. So the idea that we should think of the planet as a whole, as personified in a way. Perhaps at that point, I don't know, kind of a kind Mother Nature. Later on, in the work of, among others, Bruno Latour, so the philosopher slash anthropologist, it was a bit of a vengeful personae, but still a whole. So there was planetary awareness going on. It was also the time of the space race between the United States of America and the USSR, so Russia at that time. So space came into the mix, of course, and then I want to, I don't know, share some photos from that time. So this one is from the Apollo 8 mission. Is this right? So this is the first full disk image of the Earth from space. And it's taken by astronaut William Anders. This is from the same mission. This is perhaps the most famous one. It's become known as Earthrise. And pictures like these have spurred what has become known as the overview effect. So that when you're an astronaut, when you're in outer space, looking back, you don't see any boundaries, you don't see any conflicts. You just see a fragile ball of life, a pale blue dot. Although I must say that an astronaut that I interviewed, I think maybe even in this room 8 or 9 years back, Jeffrey Hoffman, although he was present digitally as well, but before we really got to I don't know, experience that on a daily basis. So at that time it felt like he was talking to us from outer space, from the space station, I don't know, from the screen. Doesn't really matter, but he was there and he was talking about his experiences also with this overview effect. And he said, well, I did see changes, of course, on Earth. I did see the Amazon growing smaller. I did see deserts expanding. So it's not like you don't see things happening from out of space, but it's different things that you notice. Mind you, he also remarked that that space is a hostile place. So when he went on spacewalks, so working on the space station outside, he argued you really feel that this is a place that you cannot really live in. It's not meant for humans. It's this is something that I'm reminded of a lot when I hear about plans of, I don't know, colonizing Mars or something. These are strange places that we're not really, I don't know, not really fit for humans, perhaps. So cherish the Earth that we do have. This is one quote on the overview effect that I just thought I'd include from Michael Collins, so one of the astronauts on the Apollo 11 mission. So he said, the thing that really surprised me, that the Earth, projected an air of fragility. And why, I don't know to this day. I had the feeling it's tiny, it's shiny, it's beautiful, it's home, and it's fragile. I want you to, I don't know, have this notion of fragile in the back of your head from now on. I'll return to it in the end. So it's fragile. We live on a fragile planet. Then finally, is this the picture that I wanted? Yeah. Also a famous picture. This is blue marble, taken on the Apollo 16 mission by Eugene Cernan, I think, who remarked something quite interesting. He said, we went to explore the moon, because that's what they did on that mission, and in fact discovered the Earth, because they looked back. And I think this is important to think in mind. We might think we have, at that time also, at the brink of, to put it in Star Trek terms, go boldly where no man had gone before. But then he looked back and gained some kind of planetary awareness. I want to zoom in on this notion of planetary awareness. But first, I want to turn to the apocalypse, to eschatological anxieties. So this is a quote from a quite famous book on, I don't know, our fascination for the end, for the apocalypse, from Frank Kermode. So he writes, there is nothing at all distinguishing about the eschatological anxieties. So our fears for the end of the world, the end of times, the last days, doomsday, etc. This anxiety attaches itself to the eschatological means available. It is associated with changing images. And we can best talk about the differentiae of modern crises in terms of the literature it produces. So, Dune as well. It is by our imagery of the past and the present and future, rather than in the uniqueness of our crisis, that the character of the apocalypse must be known. So the question then is, what does Dune have to teach in relation to the apocalypse, perhaps in relation to the ecological crisis that I think has sunk in by now, we're in? So how can Dune, I don't know, what does Dune have to say to teach us about that? And then also to teach about this fear of the end, these eschatological anxieties. Mind you, they might sometimes also be fantasies, apocalyptic fantasies. It can be quite pleasing to, I don't know, to imagine the end, perhaps especially post-apocalyptic fiction, because then, I don't know, you're ready for what will come after, and you have some kind of control, which is, I think, something that we aspire to in our apocalyptic fantasies. So in science fiction also, we might think that we imagine some coming apocalypse, but in fact we're imagining the one that's already taking place. So this is what I would like to, I don't know, the idea that I want to start out from today. So perhaps we should focus more on the slow apocalypse of extinction that is already taking place, that I would argue is spurred by us, I don't know, forgetting about the ecological really, and what it means to be an ecological being. Okay, Dune, turning to Dune. So Dune is really the first novel that's very much concerned with this planetary awareness, and that is also concerned with ecology in a planetary sense. So what is planetary ecology? And the freemen, so the freemen who are indigenous to this planet, they face some kind of dilemma. So on the one hand, they want to terraform the planet, I don't know, use water, this requires water, but on the other hand, they want to avoid the extinction of the sandworms that produce the spice. And as is pointed out many times in the book, there is a relationship between worm and spice. So you need the desert. If you want the worms, you need the desert. So they really need to keep the desert in place, for they depend on the spice for their livelihoods. Also because they're kind of addicted to it, I think. But I'll just leave that. Perhaps we can address it in the discussion afterwards. So what we see here is a clash, of course, between the short term and long term, because on the long term you might want to terraform, but on the short term you really need the money. And we also see a clash then between economy, or perhaps politics, a bit intertwined, and ecology. So as one of the main characters, he's called both the planetologist, the planetary ecologist, and the ecologist. Keynes, interesting names for him, but Keynes at one point in the book says Arrakis could be an Eden if its rulers would just look up from grubbing for spice. So yeah, if we don't focus on the spice, it could be an Eden. Although, then it would of course be a very different place. So I want to share two quotes from the book, from this Keynes character that I think is very interesting, and that tells us something about the importance of ecology in the book and the notion of ecology. So I'll just read them in full, because I just will. I have them here as well, so now I won't look up. So he writes, the highest function of ecology is understanding consequences. So I think this is interesting in itself. So ecology is very much concerned with trying to look into the future in ways, trying to find, get a grip on the consequences of your action. And the voice shocked him, Keynes, because he recognized it and knew the owner of it was dead. It was the voice of his father, who had been a planetologist here before him. As his father long died, killed in the cave at Plester Basin. To the working planetologist, his most important tool is human beings, his father said. You must cultivate ecological literacy among the people. That's why I've created this entire new form of ecological notation. He's repeating things he said to me when I was a child, Keynes thought. Bit of a difficult quote to include here, because at this point Keynes not doing very well. He's delirious in a way, so he's hearing the voice of his father talking to him. Apparently his father lectured to him a lot, so it's a strange quote, but I found it interesting nonetheless, not only because of this notion of ecological literacy, so we need to become literate in ecology, so knowing about the way we are connected to others in all these different kinds of ways. So the importance of that, but also the father-child relation and also the way in which generations are incorporated here. I think that part of ecological literacy is seeing yourself as part of a larger whole, also in a generational, as part of generations. So this is why I wanted to include it in full. And I imagine then that, I don't know, being a planetologist is something that is goes from father to son, perhaps a daughter. The interesting thing is, of course, that in the adaptation by Villeneuve, Keynes is indeed a woman. So, great. A change for the change for better. Another quote, but I'll leave this one because I'm going to run out of time otherwise. I want to discuss with you the notion of desert power. That's very important in the book. I don't think it features very much in the movie, so I do really hope you've read the book. Otherwise, I try to introduce it anyway. But before I do that, I want to turn to Elisabeth Povinelli. She's an Australian anthropologist who explores the notion of geontopower. So she argues that she relates to this concept of the Anthropocene, so the idea that we're living in a time of man in which we have become not only planetary aware maybe, but also have come a planetary force on a geological scale. And she remarks that some conceptualize the beginning of the Anthropocene as the realization that the Earth, Gaia, is something that could be destroyed by human action, and dramatize the difference between life as a planetary phenomenon and non-life as the coldness of space. So I mentioned earlier that I think that we should keep in mind that space is a cold place. Elisabeth Povinelli would say, well, you're making quite a distinction then between life and non-life. That perhaps is not as rigid as you think. So we tend to favor life and do all kinds of crazy stuff to further it. And perhaps we should remember that we come from non-life. So in the beginning, of course, there was non-life. That's where life came from. So keep that in mind. She refers with this notion of geontopower to Michel Foucault's notion of biopower. I'll try and say a little thing about it just to get you a grip on biopower so you can understand geontopower. But it's very much concerned with the way in which our lives are regulated via institutions also. So the governing of our physical bodies also through public health, both mentally and physically. So managing birth, death, illness, disease, sexuality through certain institutions. So we're managed. And the idea is that we're managed because we want to further life. So we want to be lively, so focus very much on life, on bios. And then she argues nowadays we seem to be living in a time of geontopower. So the idea is that there is a distinction between life. We distinct very much life from non-life. We say that life is good. So in biopower, it's life and death. That's the main distinction. And then we want to focus very much on life, and death is wrong. In a way. And here we focus very much on life and forget about non-life. And she argues that this is a form of power that tries to keep all problematic ways of dealing with the world, like extractivism of minerals, of oil also. These are, of course, non-life things, so oil and minerals, they're non-living. And the idea is that we can just extract because it's non-life. It hasn't got any value, really, so it won't really affect us. But then we forget about the fact that when we deal with non-life matters, they influence us nonetheless, and they influence life as well. So we shouldn't think of them really as, I don't know, part of a binary, but they're integrated. So life and non-life should be thought together in a way. So I hope I have unpacked this a bit, because I think that the notion of desert power is very much an example of this geontopower. So in the beginning of the novel, the Duke remarks, our supremacy on Caladan, the Duke said, dependent on sea and air power, here we must develop something I choose to call desert power. And then later on in the book, we read, so you heard my father, the Duke is dead by now, you heard my father speak of desert power, Paul said. There it is. The source of this planet is ours. No storm, nor creature, nor condition can stop us. So this desert power is very much concerned with extracting, with controlling, with trying to control the planet. And then, of course, the question is, what happens there? Is that the kind of way to relate to the planet that would, I don't know, help us out in the end? That would be ecologically sound. I think finally I'll talk a bit like the desert. Sorry, I have a few more minutes left. I think I want to introduce one more figure. So we discussed desert power. Now I want to discuss this figure of the desert because, so again, Elisabeth Pofinelli argues there are three main figures in our time. She calls it late liberalism, not going to explain it. But she says there are three main figures in this time. So the animists, that's associated with vitality, with life. The desert, that's associated with the inert, with death. And then the virus, that's kind of in between. So the virus, it's always unclear. Is a virus dead? Is it alive? It's an in-between figure. She writes that the desert stands for it stands for the terror of life's possible extinction. So it heightens the drama of the constant peril of life. So the desert embodies the idea that we might, life might be extinguished and go away, and this leads to all kinds of anxieties. So the deserts hold on to the distinction between life and non-life, and then dramatizes the possibility that life is always at threat from the creeping sense of non-life. So it's always a fear that non-life will win. And then she argues that the desert, in this as a figure, then works as we imagine it to be some kind of inert, inactive space that welcomes a technological fix, or that welcomes, I would say, extractivist behavior. So we want to, we can do whatever we want with it. So control-like behavior. So this desert power, I would say, is then something that we want to avoid. We don't want to have this desert power. We want to have a less controlling way of relating to the desert, of thinking about the desert. Perhaps it's not such a, dangerous environment after all. And then finally, I want to turn to these natives of Arrakis, so the freemen. These are interesting. This is an interesting people because they know about the desert, so they know a way around the desert. And they're called spice hunters, and that made me think of other figures that are introduced in this novel, Anthropology as well, very theoretical, but amazing book, The Mushroom at the End of the World. So you'd think it's really about the end of the world, apocalyptic, perhaps it is, but it's mostly about the Matsutake mushroom, and this is apparently a mushroom that is not really fit for capitalist ways of dealing with it. So you can't grow it anywhere. Not everyone is good at finding it. You can't cultivate it. You can't grow it in that sense. So it disturbs all the supply chains that we try to have move around the world. And the Matsutake pickers, so the ones who actually find the mushrooms, they are interesting figures because they know their way around the forests where these mushrooms grow. So that got me thinking. So these spice hunters might be akin to the Matsutake pickers, I hope, in Anat Singh's book. So yeah, we don't want that controlling desert power. We want, we want a shared sense of precarity. We want to, and that's how I return to the precarity I mentioned earlier. So this is something that Anat Singh also stresses at the end of her book. Living in the Anthropocene, being should not be just about the anthropos, about humans, but about feeling this, or finding that shared sense of precarity that we share. That humans and animals and plants even share. We're all precarious beings. So then returning to the blue dot, the fragile ball from the beginning. And then, just for laughs, in the end, because we have to discuss the worms. Let's go to the worms. So in Dune, the worms are gigantic. They are central states. They're frightening beings. But in real life, we don't see the worms. But perhaps they're kind of unseen heroes. Lowly creatures that we cannot do without, although we hardly notice them, because they make the soil, they digest, they restore. And we found a couple of years back that, I want to go here, that the insects are dying. This has been called an insect Armageddon. There is no talk of a worm Armageddon yet, but these tiny creatures are creatures we have to pay attention to. So perhaps the lesson not to draw from Dune would be being very much amazed by these great, giant, apocalyptic worms. That was it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Lisa. I feel like you've fulfilled a bit of the Paul character there being so prescient, because lots of things you talked about, I think we'll touch on things that I'd like to talk about, if not here, then our conversation. So maybe I steal some of your language in my talk. So thank you all for being here. I too, much like Lisa, had Dune sort of on the mental shelf of things to read at some points, and after getting the call to be here and speak tonight, I made it made a strong effort over the summer to read not only the book, but continue through the original trilogy, and that's about as far as I've made it. So I hope I don't spoil too much. I'll try to keep it just to the film and perhaps the first book. Maybe we go to mine. There we go. In an interview from 1984, shortly after the release of the now infamous David Lynch film, David Lynch adaptation, author Frank Herbert said the following: "Dune, they say, is religious commentary. The religious commentary statement I was trying to create with Dune is that messiahs should come with a label on their forehead, may be dangerous to your health." Now, there's a great deal we could talk about when it comes to Dune. And, of course, the recent adaptation by Villeneuve, whether it be politics or ecology, any number of things, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about a lot of these together, especially the sort of intricacies and the problems that I think Herbert is doing and also Villeneuve is representing in his film. But for my brief talk here, and I'll try to keep it brief, I want to focus on a couple of aspects that has been labeled as the title within the realm of, say, religion in the book of Dune or the movie of Dune, and that's what Herbert calls the religious commentary. And the first, as you might guess from my title, is this notion of messianism, Herbert's take on the Messiah myth. I also want to talk then about his a sort of secondary and related aspect of the Messiah myth, and that's how humanity plays a role in the cosmos, so very much picking up from Lisa's talk. And that humanity becomes the center of the world, the center of the cosmos, and indeed I will hopefully argue or show that humanity becomes the God of the universe, with the potential to create and also to destroy. For in that same interview, Herbert went on to add about his religious commentary that in creating the characters for Dune, I went to the Messiah story that's so strong in our mythology, but I wasn't going to do the Jesus story. I was trying to create a mythology that would give people a different view on how we give our lives to leaders, not just to messiahs, but to people who pose as leaders, who make themselves our leaders, who entice us into following them. Now, before unpacking what I think Herbert meant and saying here, and what he might have meant in his critique of Messianism within his book, I first want to offer a little bit of background about the notion of the Messiah. Now, this idea of a messianic myth is quite popular in popular culture and in public consciousness, and has been for centuries. I teach particularly in the ancient world, and so I might do a little bit of that here and jump into the past, where we see this historical development of the notion of Messiah by looking at the term itself. It comes from ultimately from Hebrew, Mashiach. That means the anointed or the chosen one. And it's this idea that there is an individual that has been chosen by God to come and to restore, to save, to lead, and to conquer. In the ancient Israelite and ancient Jewish context, the restoration, the healer, the restorer comes from the line of David, these ancient kings. This line has been destroyed, and the myth of the Messiah developed within the Jewish consciousness during the time of Greeks and Romans, these Greek and Roman empires that controlled much of the ancient Mediterranean. And they developed this idea that eventually God would send the Mashiach, the Messiah, to restore our Davidic throne. Now, this took several different iterations in ancient Jewish thought. Some of it was simply what we call the political, and I think Herbert is picking up a bit on that as well. We think of a political Messiah that is local, that is, we might say, more direct, and the idea that the Messiah is simply to come and kick out the empire and let us have our own kingdom, and just simply restore our own kingdom. But this quickly came to also have a much broader idea that when this Messiah comes, it's not just to kick out the evil Romans from our land of Israel, but God's Messiah is come to kick out all the evil people from the entire world. So what we have then is what we might refer to as an apocalyptic Messiah, a Messiah that is cosmic in scale. Now, as many of you that may have taken some courses or done some reading, this is the context, the political and the social context, out of which many of the writings of the New Testament were born. And indeed, this is partly what Herbert is referring to by the Jesus Messiah myth. It's Jesus as this Messiah that comes and on a cosmic scale. We have this fully developed sort of messianic hope. However, I think Herbert does a slight disservice to himself and to his critique. While as he said in the quote that I gave you, he was not trying to reproduce the so-called Jesus mythology. By making this statement, I think he inadvertently sort of put the Jesus myth in this sort of safe space that's this sort of pure thing that has like good intentions and is not dangerous. And meanwhile, there's other messianic myths that lead to the problems that he points out through his novel. So what he does not say explicitly, and what one may now think of as the sort of messianic myth, popular thought among many Christian groups today, and perhaps even among a number of Jewish and Islamic groups, is this idea that there is sort of this messianic myth that brings sort of hope for the future. Now, many critics of Herbert criticize him and for basically saying that he's indeed has put this Christian messianic myth, albeit in an alternate form, that he's operating exclusively in a Christian worldview in terms of his religious mythology. And even if he was trying to critique it, that this is simply still the world that he's occupying in. But readers of the book, and it doesn't come out as much in the movie, might know that you see that the language of the Fremen, who represent sort of religion as it's coded in Herbert's book, that much of their language and their mythology is indeed inspired by Arabic literature and Islamic literature. And in fact, much of the messianism, or at least the language we see in Dune, is evoking these Islamic notions. In particular, the term that the Fremen have for the Messiah is the Mahdi, The Mahdi is a term he's directly borrowed from several Islamic mythologies about especially Shiism. It's a term that means something like the rightly guided one, and for a particular group known as the Twelver Shiites, it refers to this 12th imam that's in occultation, as it said, in hiding, that is to reveal himself in some time in the distant future and reestablish God's rule on earth. Now, as you can probably hear, there are, of course, similarities between some Christian versions of Messianism and that Islamic version. And I think Herbert is sort of blending these together to problematize this notion of what a Messiah is and how dangerous it indeed can be. And so this is why I critique him for putting the sort of Jesus Messiah out of the box, because he's presenting the Jesus Messiah as we like to think of it, or some like to think of it, as this nice and neat, safe thing. He clearly only maybe read part of the Gospels, but if you read much of the rest of the Gospels, and in particular the book of Revelation, where we have the development of the apocalyptic Messiah, that we see that Jesus is not exactly the friendly Messiah. Or the messianic figure is not this gentle peacegiver, teacher of ethics to sort of establish some sort of peace on earth, but indeed is, as you can see in the painting here, that Jesus, or the messianic figure, is the rider on the white horse, the conqueror, as it's called in Revelation. And if you can spy a little bit, and this isn't the full painting sort of zoomed in, behind it is the red horse representing war. This is the part that I think while Herbert has sort of talked himself into a corner, that is, I think, what I see most interesting in Dune, is that he very much picks up this messianic myth. He reestablishes this notion that for many Christian communities and many thought communities for the past few centuries have seen the messianic myth not as this gentle sort of hope and longing for the future for the oppressed, but indeed it has a second half, a second side, that the Messiah comes with war. There's a certain amount of messianic discourse of describing the Messiah as the peace bringer or the peacemaker, and it, for those that are sort of political philosophers or analyses of political discourse these days, to describe, say, UN people as peacekeepers, or all these sorts of terms that we use when in essence, conquering or colonizing different parts of the earth, we say we're bringing peace, we're bringing civilization, these kinds of terms that are used. That indeed, this is what Herbert is picking up on. With Paul Atreides, he is this Messiah, and I think the most important scene, at least in the film by Villeneuve, it might be get lost in the hustle, and I think that the book explores it a bit further, but I'm hoping in the part 2 we'll see it more, is the scene between Paul and his mother, Jessica, in the tent, and he finally has this sort of somewhat fully aware dream about what it means for him to take up the mantle, to answer the call, and become the Duke. But not only become the Duke, become the Mahdi, or Mu'adib, as he's called, taking off the little mouse. For him to become the Messiah, what comes with it, and I wish we could show the clip, but we can't. What comes with it is this: our armies. He's the rider on the white horse, followed by war, and after war, if you could expand out the painting, is famine and plague. And indeed, death is the final horse. Now, I think Herbert is playing with this idea that Messiah is not a safe figure. Messiah brings death, brings genocide, brings all sorts of troubles. It is a dangerous figure. And the most intriguing, I think, tension between this, again, thinking about that scene in the tent, and so for those that haven't seen it, pay attention during this part. It's really loud and lots going on, and you might miss it. Is the tension between the personal, the intimate, and the cosmic, the broad. One of the most enthralling things about Dune, as many people know, is the scope, right? That the exposition is done through broad landscapes, and that applies not only to space, like the openness of the desert. It's shown beautifully in the film. One of my favorite aspects of the Villeneuve film is just this, the way that he has just engrossed us into the world. but also not just space, but also time. Dune, as you further read, and hopefully, Lisa, it will intrigue you a bit more philosophically as you read further, is this notion of time and the playfulness with time that comes with Paul. We see it first with eating the spice, but it's also alluded to already in earlier parts about how the trading guild, the way that they can interact, how they can travel from one planet to the other instantaneously is through the spice. And this notion that they can see the future just enough to where they can arrive safely. So there's the notion that space is not just about distance, but it's about time. And to come back to my point about this tension between the intimate and the cosmic, or sort of the local and the cosmic, is that as we will see with Paul's decisions, and he sort of reflects back on it in this tent scene, is that every personal decision he makes, us as viewers, we're on his side. He's the good guy. Like on the one hand, Herbert does that classic sort of good versus evil, Atreides versus Harkonnens, right? He problematizes it so because every good decision, every right moral decision by the protagonist, Paul, leads to further conflict. It leads to further conflict both within the immediate scene, whether it be the threat to himself, the threat to others, and of course, the threat to the Fremen. But this scene in the tent, and further in, as we hopefully we will see in the book in the second film, is that every time he makes a decision to save himself, to save his mother, to save other people, maybe I won't spoil everything, it seems like the right decision. But what follows is death. What follows is genocide. He sees himself in the tent scene, leading an army of Fremen, conquering the galaxy with the Atreides banner on the flag, and it scares him to death because the Messiah is not this peaceful and is not this bringer of peace as one might think, or at least if it's the bringing of peace comes through conquest. Now, the second aspect, if I have a couple minutes, has to do with how did Paul become the Messiah, the Mu'adib. We live in a world long in the future, so we might call this in some sense a post-apocalyptic world, but say a post-post-apocalyptic world. The near apocalypse had happened millennia before, where there was this, Herbert is so great for this sort of prescience about how we think about apocalypses even only a few years later. Reminds me a lot of Terminator, as that what's happened in the past, from our perspective in Dune, is there was this near conquest and destruction of humanity by machines. It's called the Butlerian Jihad, this war. And by the way, that humans were the ones that were initiating the jihad against the machines. And after it, they recreated a new society where machines were no longer allowed. And so we are millennia in the future, and humans have evolved to make up for all the needs that they have that machines had been doing before, including space travel, as I've mentioned. Spice as the important element that allows humans to evolve to time travel in a sense you could think of it that way, but to space travel, to see the future, among other things. But we also get a little bit into a picture into the world. This is especially from the book, but it's sort of hinted at in the movie. There are a number of evolved human types, ones that aren't really, they're there, but they aren't explained in the film. For those that have seen it and wasn't sure what was happening, there are a couple of people that they're asked a question by the leader. They're standing beside them, and their eyes roll back, and then they come back with an answer. These are called the Mentats. They are the human computers. They have developed a method for computing massive amounts of data in a very short amount of time, like a computer. There are a number of other people that have a number of other types of evolved groups and communities, but one of which also is the Bene Jesuit. And I think this is perhaps the one I find to be most intriguing, not only because of what their mission is, but also because of how it affects Paul directly, is that his mother is a Bene Jesuit. And this is a group of women. It's a sort of an evolved trait or gene that only shows itself in women and has for centuries, and they have developed a plan to cultivate sort of a genetic crossbreeding of several different families to where ultimately they'll create the perfect human, who unfortunately would be male. So all these females have worked for millennia to create the perfect human, and the perfect human happens to be male. So I don't really want to jump into the sort of feminism of that, maybe in the conversation. But what I think is interesting and how this touches on what I mean by messianism is that Paul is the Messiah. The Kwisatz Haderach is how it's called, is the Messiah by creation, by manufacture. Hence the title of my talk. Is that on the one hand, it takes away the magic, it takes away the sort of the allure of the Messiah if it's something that humans have done by design. Now, there's a sort of a tension there in that Paul is not supposed to be the Kwisatz Haderach. There was a sort of a hiccup in the system. So this hiccup does leave us at least a little bit like on his side that he was destined to. And this leads me to the final point that I want to make, and I hope I can talk about more in our conversation, is that what's missing from this world is God. There is no divine. At least not in the way we might think of it. And I think it's epitomized, one, in this notion that humans are the ones that create everything. Humans are the ones that even formulate the Messiah myth, as we find out, and it's only mentioned briefly in the movie, but we find out in the books a little more explicitly, the Bene Jesuit, to make the world prepared for this Kwisatz Haderach, for the Messiah. They have gone around every sort of planet in the cosmos and implanted centuries ago, this is some long-term planning, centuries ago, thoughts in the mind of the indigenous peoples about how eventually there will be a Messiah. And so by the time we get to the sort of present day of the Dune book, we have this Fremen people who have, I don't want to say that. I almost said the expression "drink the Kool-Aid," but I mean, for those that and Herbert in that same interview, by the way, it's worth watching. Like brings up about how Jim Jones is this sort of he uses the word marvelous, which I think is a bit too, an enthralling kind of character about how a Messiah figure can be gripping. But in any case, the Fremen have taken this prophecy that was implanted to them, manufactured by the Bene Jesuit centuries ago, and have expanded upon it dramatically. And so Paul then is, in a sense, representing a Messiah, but not a mythological one, not a divinely ordained one, but a manufactured one. And his role as Messiah is self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is a drawing. I knew I would forget the artist's name. I should have written it down. Amazing. This is a pen and on paper, like a ballpoint pen on paper. Amazing artist. It's titled The Self-Fulfilling Prophecy of Narcissus and the Mushroom. So I like the idea of the mushroom that also touched on it too. It is this idea in Dune, I got off track there, that humanity has not only manufactured their own, say, religion, to unfortunately use that term, but they manufactured their own myths, their own mythology, their own salvation, and they indeed have made themselves into gods. And this is epitomized by the universal code. They have this sort of allusion to the religious past, and one of them is called the OC Bible that some of the people refer to a number of times. But the primary commandment, the one that we hear several times, is this: "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind." Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. Now, for those that have taken my exegesis of the Hebrew Bible course, this should sound a bit familiar. This commandment is reminiscent of the second commandment of the Ten Commandments, and by the Protestant reckoning, because I do think he's dealing with sort of a Protestant way of approaching the text. So I'll refer to the second commandment of the Old Testament. And in the old King James, or King Jimmy as I say, idiom, it reads, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above." By this subtle allusion to a rewriting of the ancient rule, Herbert has made humanity the sacred, has made humanity that which is set apart, that which is forbidden to replicate. And so he's created then not only a world where the Messiah is something that's manufactured in the past and undercuts any sort of divine notion, that it is entirely a manufacture of humanity. Humanity has made themselves a god. This is, as you might guess, this is from one of those caves in France, I believe, from 3,000 years ago. It sort of evokes this image that once humans start to create, they have then started to create the divine. But it creates this world, it creates this notion that humanity has become the god of the cosmos. And in so doing, and manufacturing this Messiah, manufacturing a sort of humanity that controls everything, it touches on, and what I'll leave you with here on what Lisa brought up, this notion of apocalypticism or apocalyptic outlook of this is fragile, a fragile world that Paul, as we will find out, and no spoilers because I actually don't fully know the end of the story yet either, is that when he does ultimately fulfill the role of that Messiah, despite his hesitation, despite him knowing full well that making every decision that he makes will lead to genocide, he does it anyway. And it fulfills, to come back to where we began, that old messianic myth, that old apocalyptic myth, that the apocalypse in many ways is an out with the old and in with the new, to put it tritely. Out with the old requires the destruction of the world. It requires, as Lisa brought up in her talk, this ambiguous and unsolvable riddle of to create the new world that seems like a good thing, to terraform Dune, Arrakis, to make it into the green planet as the mythology of the Fremen and the goal of the Atreides, requires its destruction. Requires its destruction of its local god, Shai-Hulud, the worms. It requires the destruction of life itself, the spice. So with that, I end and hope the conversation continues, and as we think and unpack a bit more of how Paul, or how Herbert has manufactured his Messiah of Paul and undermined, critiqued, even while some way sort of rehashing an old story, making it new, where a Messiah is one that is manufactured and humanity is one that has created its own destruction. Thank you. Oh,
sit down. So that took a bit longer than we thought. So we have less time for discussion and questions from the audience. So let's just jump into it. You said I would start with you in reverse order. You talk about manufacturing messianism, the messiahs, and so on. Could you read Dune, the first novel, at least, as indeed one big critique of religion, almost Karl Marx, religion is the opiate of the people. Opiate, there's the spice, there's the melange that gives visions to people. The visions are also manufactured by the Bene Jesuit. Could you read it as a critique of religion as a whole?
I think Herbert would say yes. I think he would say, as the quote I brought up alluded to, that Messiah, the way he was trying to play with the Messiah myth is this idea that Messiahs aren't these sort of pristine, divinely ordained figures. They're manufactured, and to think about it from the human perspective, as he tries to make us do, say, by way of the Fremen, is to see it as how much are we enticed by these figures? How much are we willing to be convinced to follow them, and as it seems, much to our own self-destruction. even if, say, the immediate goal is to, as in the book and in the first movie, to sort of resist the prototypical evil of the Harkonnens, that it's that it works to its own nefarious ends as well.
Yeah. So there is a lot of manufacturing and creating expectations and so on in the book and also in the movie.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure if the quote from Marx, I hadn't thought about opiate and the spice. That's a neat connection. I don't know. I'd have to think about it more because, Marx is so much about its ruling class, versus the subservient class, or to put it in the capitalist terms, right? The owners of the production and then the means of it. I don't know. I don't think it's so simple as that. I think the idea that we have this ruling class of the houses, in one sense, is a little bit more a critique of, say, feudalism, say the Middle Ages, but also European colonialism, and not, say, capitalism itself. So.
Yeah, colonialism was something that wasn't brought up, but we also colonized the earth. European colonialism. There's a lot of critique of that in the book. In the movie, not as much, maybe. But what is your take on that, Lisa?
Well, especially the way in which I tried to get this notion of geonto power in, because that's very critical of extractivism as well. Because so first of all, I really like this notion of extractivism that is used more and more. So the way in which we relate to the earth as something that can be extracted from. So it's like it's of course in line with colonialism, but then mostly related not too much to there's hardly any humans involved. Well, not like there were in the old days. But there's there's a similar take. So there's this space, this land. Now it's mine. Although I'm not really sure about what happened way back on Arrakis. But that way of thinking. But that's still There's still a very extractivist way of thinking also on Arrakis. Although I feel like this Fremen people, there's some potential there to relate differently. So.
But there's a tension there, because there's also this idea to terraform indeed the desert planet in the same way, but at the same time they are the keepers of the spice. So we could make a comparison with oil. I think Herbert had oil in mind.
1965, certainly.
1965. Do you see this tension? If you look at the Fremen, on the one hand, it's this myth of terraforming Arrakis to make it into a green planet. On the other hand, they are also, in a way, exploiters of spice, aren't they?
Yeah, and addicted to it.
Yes.
Yeah. So addicted to oil themselves as well. And mind you, when I relate the Fremen, the spice hunters, also to this notion of the Matsutake mushroom, then I find the Matsutake pickers. But the thing is here that before you know it, you're romanticizing. So it's like these noble people that have a way with dealing with their environments. They are attuned. So we aren't. So we're the extractivist kind, and they're the good kind. And we have to learn from them in a way. So I see that I'm, on dangerous ground there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Seth,
that, just to add briefly, I think the only sort of cringe moment in the movie for me was when the Atreides first arrived, and it's such a beautiful scene and so epic in like the scale, in the Villeneuve style. But they come out to the sound of bagpipes, right?
Yeah.
It's to make part of sci-fi and fantasy is that it's set elsewhere, but there's aspects of it that make the strange familiar, right? Mm-hmm. And so we can identify with these, hobbits or whatever, in any world we're thinking. And the bagpipes speaks to a particular sort of past, and juxtaposed, so then here's the sound juxtaposed as the bagpipes coming out as they're coming down, and meanwhile the crowd of the locals, of the Fremen, are screaming in what's Arabic-ish, about how here come the messiahs.
Yes. I found it such a powerful scene.
It's powerful, but it made me cringe a bit. If you've any sort of Orientalist kind of aspect, and as you brought up, this sort of notion of the noble savage, right? That we can learn from them while we extract and conquest and claim this land as ours is a bit difficult. So I can't quite tell if Villeneuve, I think, and Herbert are critiquing this or sort of reinscribing it.
Because Villeneuve is he invents this scene, but the idea of the Freeman as the noble savage is very much in the novel, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah.
So
they're this misunderstood from the royal houses, and they're grossly underestimated, right, by their Harkonnens, and it turns out that they have all this great technology of how to survive and how to adapt in this dune in Arrakis, and make use of the spice. And so here maybe I'm thinking about it now. Your Marx comment might be a little bit there, right? As you said, Lisa, that the extractive aspect is sort of the capitalist, like you talked with the mushroom, whereas they make use of the spice, the Fremen, but it's presented to us in a way that it's sort of organic part of the lifestyle, and it's sort of reminiscent of depictions of Native Americans where the white conquerors came and just wiped out the buffalo and only used it for the meat and the hide, and that's it, and left the rest, whereas the Native Americans used every bit of it and it was sort of integrated into their lifestyle, and therefore it's sort of this, again, that sort of noble savage kind of narrative. So like I said, I'm sort of on the fence about how to feel about that. Yeah. It's certainly there, and it's in the source material in Herbert itself.
How are you feeling about it? I was thinking about the worms and the relation the Freemen have to the worms, because there's only one scene, also again powerful scene in the movie where you see a Freeman riding the worms. So the Freemen are able to control them, whereas for the exploitator, for the people that exploit the spice, the worms are dangerous. Yeah. They are a threat. Could you comment a little bit on that?
Well, I would say that the interesting part here is, of course, the difference between, trying to get a feel for this creature, and then and then you can move with it, and then all this one figure moving with this gigantic creature, and then all the technology that they bring into play to deal with these worms, to harvest the spice. Yeah. I would say that this is a way of Herbert telling, all these technologies, machines, etc., for harvesting the spice. This control-like relation to the spice and to the worms. That's problematic. We should, try and find a way to come at it from another end, from another. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was also thinking about something that connected to both your talks, is the whole figure of the desert. So Arrakis is Earth, but in the year 10,000 something, this desertification, and you talked about that, the figure of the desert. But I'm also thinking about the way the desert figures in religion. The desert is the place where religions are born. In the Hebrew world, it's an important figure. It's in Christian world. In the Islamic tradition, of course, the desert plays an important role. Could you perhaps comment a bit on that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think he is drawing on, in a sense, sort of ancient Hebrew or Israelite mythology of desert as this place of production, as opposed to that, say, the place of danger or death or chaos. And I think we can sort of superficially make a comparison of ancient, say, Egyptian mythology, where there was the Black Land, which is where nice, rich soil is. Probably worms are involved, around the Nile in ancient mythology. And then there was the chaos, which is the desert, the red land, represented in all sorts of forms, including by Seth.
Yeah.
And in contrast, so we have the story of the Exodus, right, where the Israelites, this very, say, minority small group against the big bad empire of the Egyptians, they tell their mythology about how they were created in the desert, right? Mm-hmm. We have these sort of the scene of fleeing from Egypt, and then they have 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Some stories remember this as a time of pains, of turmoil, like they're constantly complaining and things are going bad. But many of them refer to this time as sort of the time of an idyllic, almost Edenic kind of time where it was just the Israelites and God and nothing else, because they were in a desert. And they had this sort of covenant, this mutual relationship, and that was how the people of Israel were created. So I could keep talking about this forever. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting ways that water plays into that mythology. There's a classic scene in the Exodus is crossing the Red Sea. It evokes creation mythology of God as that which conquers the chaotic waters. And so it's also evoking, it uses language of birth metaphors of that a human is created by coming between the parting waters of the amniotic fluid. And thus Israel is born as the people of God first by the crossing of the Dead Sea, or the Yom Suf, in the Exodus, and then later, after the 40 years, they cross again, miraculously, waters that have been parted of the Jordan River to enter into the land of Israel, and here we have then the creation of the people of Israel.
How do you see that back in the movie? How does it work in the movie?
Yeah, so what I think plays in the movie is this idea that the desert is this creative space, as you've said, and that water is still life, right? And it's sort of this sacred aspect that belongs to the tribe, right? The death rituals, for example, and when anyone dies, their water belongs to the community. I don't quite see, say, a parting of the Red Sea kind of myth. I mean, I think perhaps, not to spoil the second half, but there is a certain notion that there is civilization in Arrakis from the colonialist point of view. It are the cities, and then there's the desert, and that's the Fremen. And the boundary, there's a physical boundary, the shield wall between the two, and that gets breached, broken, transgressed. This notion of crossing over happens, and in the midst of that crossing over, there's a new world that's created, a new political and religious order, to be as general as possible. But
the desert is also a dangerous place. It's something to be avoided. It's something you have to survive. That ties in a little bit more with the apocalyptic image of the desert that this earth now is actually becoming. So that's a completely different picture of the desert.
You mean our Earth now?
Our Earth now.
Yeah, sure. But then, I don't know. I do like the ambiguity in the movie and in the book in relation still to the desert. So I think nowadays we tend to get fed with apocalyptic fantasies. Also, so the Earth will become one big desert. So desertification is like something we really. This is something we must most fear. Well, I think this take on it tells us, and I think also from, although I'm not a biologist, but perhaps from that point of view as well, that it's all about what you do in the desert, and do you know you're around the desert? Can you, can you find a life there? And of course, in Dune they can. So that's the thing. So when we start, from our still, we have a lot of soil worms from our, the black part, very much fearing the desert. Then it's like, oh my gosh, there's something coming that will just wipe us out.
Yes.
But then, we should perhaps try and find a way to embrace the desert also, and not just
learn to deal with it and with its worms. And also, try and find a way for the. So the ambiguity in that, because of course it is a dangerous place, and you will tend to die there earlier, especially if you're not adapted. So yes, it is a dangerous place. Then again,
familiarize yourself, something
Uh-huh.
along these lines.
Yeah. I think it's time for you and for you at home to ask questions. So menti.com, the code is 3117689. Is it projected? No, it isn't. But that's the code. It is.
Yeah.
Good. Let's see whether this works. I see no questions yet, but ask your questions. I'm sorry for you in the audience, you still have to do it through Menti. Next time we'll have microphones again. Maybe a question, it's no coincidence he's called Paul, isn't it? That's a question I have to ask a scholar of religion, sorry.
Yeah, I know. And you even prepared me for this, and I still haven't decided what to think. I don't know.
You don't know.
Paul is this complicated figure, right? He's the persecutor of Christians, right? And then becomes the Christian. So, I mean, in some ways it models this idea that the Atreides are the conquerors of the Fremen. And I do like the movie that, like, we don't get much from them. It's sort of toward the end. And I think anticipating we'll get a lot more in the second half. And there's one of the lines by Chani, who's they're sort of negotiating how things are going to go, and she was like, "Well, I'm going to paraphrase it horribly, but something like, regardless of whoever our imperialists, colonialists are, like, they're still you're still gonna take our spice, you're still gonna ravage our lands, kind of thing." And so Paul goes from being that to being, say, one of them, and so there's this sort of notion of, to put it in those terms, a sort of conversion from
conqueror
to part of the community,
to even leader of the community.
And sort of the revelation again is sort of manufactured by way of the spice, by the melange. He does this sort of corrupted version of the Bene Jesuit ritual. That sort of opens up his eyes entirely, and he sort of, I really want to say, drink the Kool-Aid again. He does do a sort of drinking to sort of fully commit, and in this case he dies in a sense to become different. So it's sort of putting up the metaphor of the sort of the baptism and the sort of the Christian metaphor of you die and reborn again as part of the end community. So
good. Then I have to use my own eyes. Can the manufactured Messiah be a reflection or even critique on how we create gods and subsequent messiahs, a glorification which nowadays shifted to public figures? That's a question for you, Seth.
Yeah, I'll say the short answer, because I think I've talked a lot, is that Herbert would say yes, that the danger of the Messiah is that each individual decision, this charismatic leader, he's definitely blowing up on this notion of, say, populist leaders, something that's a bit familiar to us these days, not that it's anything new, is that we afford a certain amount of power and, how do you put it, truth-saying, regardless of what we might think truth is, that what they say is truth, unquestionably so. And while it may seem, okay, well, populists or messianic leaders come and go, part of the story, again, on the grand scale, is that every minute, tiny decision that Paul makes or Messiah might make has ripples across time for millennia, has ripples across the entire universe, as he says in the tent scene, that to save himself and his mother is how he boils it down. I'm basically going to bring about a conquest of the cosmos that results in the deaths of millions, if not billions. It's taken to a grand scale, but it's sort of maybe almost ad absurdum, but this idea that giving a Messiah or charismatic figure such power, every decision they make has exponential effects.
Yeah, so you could read it as a critique. That's your short answer. One for you, Lisa. Desert power is equated with utilizing the freeman. However, this exploitation is different under a treatise in Harkonnen. Can we find a root in history for this context? So the notion of the exploitation of the planet and the freeman in the Harkonnens and a treatise is different.
And then a historical comparison.
Yeah,
now
maybe, yeah.
You can butt in. I'm thinking, but then I think we would have to focus on the way in which they rule.
Yeah, we haven't talked much about the political side of it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of politics in it, isn't it?
I would say that, so the Atreides are very, I don't know, they're very much steward-like.
Yes.
Steward kind of people. But then, I don't know, who leads like that? And yeah, I'm not sure about the Harkonnen are more like, I don't know, hard rule, I don't know, like exploitators in the colonies, etc.
Yeah.
But then they both, of course, exploit, but in a different way.
Yeah.
Perhaps, I don't know what the Europeans are doing now. The stewards, the Atreides, I'm not really sure. Something.
A fascinating question.
Yeah.
We have to think about it a bit more, I'm afraid. Yeah. And there's one for both speakers. What can we take away from Dune about the role of psychedelic drugs, the mélange, the spice, in achieving ecological literacy through an embodied spirituality? Wow.
Yeah. I had that earlier. I was reminded of the ayahuasca drug.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know. We Europeans are going now to well, not in the past 2 years, but to South American countries to I don't know, to use ayahuasca and then finally experience being at one with the cosmos, with nature. But there's an interesting colonialism edge, and also a romanticizing edge, the romantic aspects there as well. So again, they are these noble savages. They're at one with nature. Their shamans are very much in touch, and then they can help us out there. And of course, the interesting thing with ayahuasca is that in the end, I never dared. I've never used it, but it always felt like some kind of shortcut to bliss or something, or a shortcut to I don't know, leading a happy life and being at peace with myself and the world.
Yeah.
And we really want to believe in that. So there's, I don't know.
But that means
the thing with ayahuasca, of course, is that I don't think it's addictive, but of course the spice is, so it's different. But it has the, I don't know, the spiritual aspect as well.
But in that sense, again, Herbert was way ahead of his time, wasn't he? I mean,
60s.
Yeah.
You know, this is. It's like all the shrooms, as you brought up, and LSD. This idea that the CIA sort of discovered this notion of opiates and wanted to utilize it. Yeah. And then the Cold War against the USSR, and yet it had sort of I sort of thought of it as sort of a bourgeois take on drugs, that it's a romanticized kind of thing that one could do. Sort of safely and even sort of, poetically as something fanciful. It's certainly, let's put it this way, it certainly is not something that was written in the 80s in terms of the way drugs are talked about. It's very much
60s,
more 60s CIA.
Yeah.
LSD in the 60s Rebellion. It's a classic book, Michael. So it's worth a read.
That's a question also, I think, for both, but let's start with you, Lisa. Both the potential of cosmic redemption through humanity, including an incarnate God, and the Anthropocene-centered humanity. Can we see in Dune any hints of post-humanism? And there's a reference to Haraway here. Yeah. Could you explain the question?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so if humanity takes central stage, and now, so they're actually gods, as you've just explained to us. Of course, the idea is that this notion of the Anthropocene that we hear a lot of nowadays has, I don't know, it seems that we are acknowledging the way in which people affect the earth, but then also be kind of humble about it. Then again, it's still very much, so who is this anthropos, and who is this human or we that's united? Because then the main critique on this notion of the Anthropocene is that it moves beyond inequalities, between people, in different cultures and nations, but also between people and animals or things, etc. So it's to a lesser extent. So this we, so the anthropos, the humanity that's united in the Anthropocene as a geological force, which of course is quite, I don't know, unfair, because the way in which I am a geological or part of this geological force is different from people in other places in the world. So, so this whole idea that humanity is a geological force does not do justice to the different ways in which we're all involved. And then it's all our fault, in the Anthropocene, it's the fault of all humans, all the anthroposes. And then so you cannot diversify and you cannot take care to, I don't know, local differences or so that's, I think, that's what the Anthropocene is all about. And then perhaps we should return to the question, because I don't think I've answered it yet.
There was a talk of post-humanity.
Yeah, in June. Well, so I've read the first book. Not in there, I think.
I think.
No, but maybe later?
Maybe. I think... I do think that Herbert plays a bit more of what it means to be human, not the effects, say, of human on the cosmos in the later books, particularly with a certain character that comes back, but is again manufactured sort of by machine. And I don't know how to speak generally, but. Short answer is yes. I'll just stop. Yes. I think it does play in the notion of a little bit of that, and maybe it's hinted at in the first book with this notion that this is in a world where, like, we want to relate because they're human, but then we realize that there's all these evolved things that are beyond what we are. I know that's sort of a reductionist take on posthumanism, but still, it's at least toying with this idea of what it means to be human is not exactly the same. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then next question. What do you think about this idea of a whole population of a planet working towards a common goal, transforming Arrakis? Maybe again, Lisa, if you start with that.
If that will be a good idea.
Yeah.
No.
No.
No, because that's the thing. A common goal, who for? Kibono, who profits?
Save the planet?
Yeah, but the planet's not the issue. Mm-hmm. Of course, so Arrakis is still there. So let's assume that it is Earth in the future. It's still there. It might be a desert planet, but it's still there. Mm-hmm. So we're not really concerned with the planet itself. Mm-hmm. I would say, but then we are concerned with those that are living on the planet, albeit they humans or not. And when you try and find a way, when you try to find an answer to the question, what's good for all, you cannot answer that question. You always run into trouble, because what's good for the one is not good for the other. That doesn't mean that there aren't certain directions yet that you can turn into that are bad for most of all involved, and therefore would not be, you wouldn't want to go there. But have one goal for all. I think that's always asking for trouble. This is this is your Messiah figure again, right?
Yes.
If we all go running after the Messiah, that's where things go wrong.
Yeah. I respond a bit of, you've talked about sort of the needs of the community versus the needs of the individual. I mean, what do you see as the sort of conception of the self here? Is this, there's sort of classic modernist kind of notions of individual and the sort of autonomy of the self. I mean, and then we encountered the Fremen, where one's own the water, like, we're 90-something% water. Some biologist knows that number, but that doesn't belong to you. It belongs to everyone. So it's sort of it's sort of, a disruption of the notion of what we are and how we conceive of ourselves. I mean, what do you make of that in terms of your counter against working together as a bad thing because it ignores the self, but maybe that's not a problem for the Fremen, at least the Fremen way of life?
I'm not really sure. Yeah. Could you, I don't know, the last bit. Where do you want to go?
I guess I'm trying to ask a roundabout way of trying to ask, is there any such thing as, say, individuality in this idealized community of the Fremen?
Fremen.
I know the movie hasn't quite got to it yet.
Yeah.
You've read the first
movies.
book.
Then the question is, and then should we try to get there, or is that a problem?
Yeah, well, maybe the reason why it never works to sort of all work together is because we all have different interests. But what if we all sort of aligned our worldviews? Do we lose ourselves? Is that critique in there that somehow we lose ourselves into the embodied person of the Messiah, if we want to put it sort of politically or religiously, or is this a critique on this sort of this notion that we are these individuals, autonomous things? I don't know how to. You're a philosopher. I don't know how to put this, but.
Well, I think it's always, I don't know, there's some kind of going back and forth here. If you relate this to, in order to live, I need some kind of individuation, identity, autonomy. There's something that's me that wants to, not so much procreate, but just keep on existing. But in order to do that, so there's something, there's the importance of something individual self that persists in the world. But then in order to do that, I need to work together. And in the end, of course, it evaporates and then becomes others again. So there's this constant going, but then so we all want to persist, but then we don't all persist in the same direction or something. Mm-hmm. So do you get my drift? Mm-hmm. So this is where where I really really have problem with the Messiah figure and the question. So how do we solve this Anthropocene ecological crisis? Like there's just one answer or just one way to go about it. Mm-hmm. I think this notion of precarity is important. Because it reminds us of our own precarity, the fact that we will die, decay, etc. That we're not immortal, although we do live on in our children, kind of. So that's
Let's hope.
So that's interesting. And then so we want to kind of make sure that that's possible, mm-hmm. that persistence. But then that's it's not on such a grand scale. I always fear all these grand scales, and I think what very much came out of your talk as well, that in this sense the Messiah figure, so especially this apocalyptic Messiah, it's always there's always war, there's
behind it,
destruction, and
we have to stop. It's past time. Thank you very much for your talks and for your engaging discussion. Thank you. Big warm round of applause for them.
All right.
Thank you for your physical presence, and thank you for your non-physical presence. I hope to see you again during a physical event of Radboud Reflects. Thank you very much, and come home safely. Bye.